Good afternoon, everyone. Father Brett here. Welcome to this sermon preparation time as we look forward to the 24th Sunday in Ordinary Time, Cycle A. What are the readings for this Sunday? Well, the first reading is taken from the book of Sirach, chapter 27, verse 30, to chapter 28, verse 7. And then our responsorial psalm is Psalm 103. We continue St. Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 14, verses 7 to 9. And then our gospel for this Sunday is from St. Matthew's Gospel, chapter 18, verses 21 to 35. And if you remember last week, our gospel was up to verse 20. So this is an immediate continuation. And if you listened to my sermon last Sunday, you would have heard that I referenced these few verses that followed last Sunday's gospel. In other words, how many times must we forgive? And that question comes from Peter, addressed to Jesus. And Peter would have been surprised by Jesus's response. He would have been expecting in the region of 3 or 4 times, because at the time of Jesus, while the scribes and Pharisees spoke about the need to be forgiving and to heal divisions and wounds, much debate, much time was spent on discussing how many times you did forgive somebody who wronged you. And most of them would have settled on about 4, and not to go past 4. So Jesus doesn't just say 7, which is always the perfect full number in Jewish thinking. He says more than that, 77 times. So fully and beyond fully, always and beyond always we forgive. And so St. Peter would have been a little startled at that. But ironically, who was to benefit the most from that unlimited forgiveness of God? St. Peter. After Jesus had died and risen and meets Peter, he forgives him clearly for the times he had denied him on Holy Thursday night. So the overarching theme for this Sunday, maybe we can take from the words of the Lord's Prayer. Forgive as you are forgiven. That's a real challenge for all of us, isn't it? Because we would tend, our human nature likes to extract vengeance. And in the first reading from the book of Sirach, there's that sense. There is that sense of getting even. If we stop and think for a moment, the context for this first reading, it is clear that the idea of forgiveness, the idea of moving from vengeance to forgiveness, is under development in the Old Testament. We know that ancient cultures, vengeance and full vengeance for any little wrong or grievance was considered acceptable. So if someone just looked at you in a strange way or said something nasty to you, you could go completely overboard in getting even. You could even kill that person. There were no limits to getting even. And so the development in the Hebrew law of a tooth for a tooth, an eye for an eye, was actually a development to limit vengeance and getting even. That getting even had to be appropriate. So if someone stole your chicken, you could not steal their ox. It had to be comparable. And so we see that in the book of Exodus, chapter 21, that law is given. But we see that there is further development. And if we look at the book of Leviticus, we hear in chapter 19, you must not exact vengeance, nor must you bear a grudge against the children of your people. You must love your neighbor as yourself. And so this first reading today is part of this development of relationships with people, how to treat one another, what punishments are expected. It's part of the development of the law and the understanding of proper relationships with the Jewish people. And so it's a very important reading, and it gives us real hope that we all need to be seeking right relationships. But it also, of course, challenges us to see how we do that. And that challenge is taken up in the gospel today. The gospel is quite familiar, I suppose, this extravagant forgiveness of the king to the one servant, and the nitpicking lack of forgiveness of that servant to a fellow servant. And so the forgiveness of God is contrasted to the forgiveness of the slave. And so we are called to consider how we forgive one another as we are forgiven. St. Paul's letter to the Romans. It's clear that St. Paul has in his mind two groups of Christians in Rome at this time, the weak and the strong. And the weak, I suppose, we would consider today, perhaps we would use this term today, traditionalists. In other words, they are faithful to the letters of the law regarding fasting and behavior and all those sorts of things. Whereas the strong we might term progressives, those who are a little bit more pushing and advancing and not too concerned about doing all things exactly. And so perhaps this really speaks to us in the modern church, where there seems to be such division between groups of Catholics, the progressives and the conservatives, or the liberals and the traditionalists. And St. Paul suggests that the weak need to be understanding and not believe that the strong have abandoned their faith. And the strong, the progressives, should not despise the weak, should not see them as limited in their faith either. And they are called to consider and remember this so that they both can live in harmony. Perhaps there's a real lesson for us in the modern church. How can we consider the different groups, the different sections of the Catholic Church, and how can we accept one another and live in harmony with one another? And so this Sunday's readings are about our attitudes towards one another. Forgive one another as I have forgiven you. Perhaps that's the theme. Perhaps we can reflect on those words. Perhaps we can reflect on our relationships with one another, how we treat one another as we prepare for this Sunday's celebration. I look forward to seeing you, and I welcome you to join us this Sunday. God bless. Have a good rest of the week. Bye-bye.